capitalist movement is an entrenchment of systems and institutions of male power and privilege. The feminist movement requires collectivism, requires equality in order to achieve its goals, and it cannot exist within the confines of institutions which ascribe value only to purchasing power. 3 questions in this speech. Firstly, on why it disempowers the movement. Secondly, on why it entrenches male power. And thirdly, on how it mutes the capacity of the movement in public spaces. But firstly, on incompatible. The important thing about this debate is that we need not prove feminism does not exist in a world in which capitalism exists. We would note that the pop-up of small individual neoliberal feminists in capitalist spaces like Sheryl Sandberg is not enough of an empirical truth for this negative team to win. We need only prove that the existence of capitalism has made the work of the feminist movement harder, that the aims the feminist movement has achieved with the existence of capitalism has occurred in spite of and not because of those institutions, and that in the absence of it, it would be better. That is what incompatible in this debate will operate as. So firstly, on why it disempowers the movement. The first thing that we say here about capitalism is that it discourages collectivization. And the importance here is simple. The feminist movement requires collective action in order to achieve its outcomes. The actions of individual women cannot achieve the goals of the feminist movement. And that's for a few reasons. The first is simply that critical mass is required in order to undo the institutions and structures in society which lock women out of power and which entrench disadvantage of women, and therefore critical mass and collectivization is the way that they literally achieve their goals. But it is also that in the absence of collectivization, the work of individual women is often to the exclusion of other women. So women within neoliberal spaces often affect other women through their outcomes, because when there is a tension between the goals of specific women, it actually hurts other women. So collectivization is the mechanism by which feminists achieve their goals, and the existence of capitalism disencourages it for a few reasons. The first is that the value of capitalism is oriented towards individualism and towards selfishness in a way that is like a zero-sum game of progression. You succeed at the cost of another person. You outdo another person. It operates in a system of competition and a system of hierarchies which require individuals to prioritize themselves to the exclusion of the collective. That's the way that the market operates. And there's also the second reason, which is that corporations and the institutions which operate within capitalism have an active incentive to discourage collectivization for the reason that it operates as an explicit threat against those institutions. They wish to retain the power of those places, and they discourage collective action within them. So selfishness is encouraged in a way that makes it much harder to collectivize in general, and therefore the primary mechanism by which feminists can succeed in achieving the aims that they require is made more difficult. But secondly, we also tell you that it atomizes the ways that these institutions work in a way that makes it much harder for women to collectivize even before the discouragement of it, which is that it encourages the prioritization of work to the exclusion of all other aims, which means that work becomes the driving force or the driving narrative of your life versus other priorities, which makes it far harder. But secondly, it makes certain forms of labor more valuable than others in a way that atomizes individuals based upon the activities they are doing. When women perform certain forms of labor that are not awarded monetary aims, their value in society is diminished, which makes it far harder to collectivize for that reason. The third thing to say is that the existence of these structures, which require hierarchies and which require selfishness, also provide incentives for movements to mirror the structures that they have symmetrically, so that feminist movements will also implement hierarchies within the ways they operate to mirror the structures or to reflect the values that the capitalist movement has imparted upon them. And that requires people into putting themselves above others or providing clout in a way that is particularly harmful in a movement which requires collectivism, because it makes women position themselves against other women and create hierarchies of power in a way that puts different movements or different parts of the feminist movements against each other rather than aligning, which is why there's fighting and conflict over the ways that we all prioritize certain issues, or the ways that certain women are more valuable than others within the feminist movement, which derives from the notion that there is a distinct value on people based upon their hierarchies and based upon their privilege, which only exists because of the norms of the capitalist movement, or which certainly the capitalist movement has entrenched in a way that makes the aims of the feminist movement harder to achieve. So at the end of this, the movement is disempowered because the capacity to collectivize is made harder through processes of atomization and structures of power which make it harder for the feminist movement to collectively achieve good outcomes. Secondly, on why it concretizes male privilege. The first thing to say is that the capitalist movement and the ideology that it ascribes to it systematically undervalues women in the way that it does this. The first reason here is the reason that I pointed to earlier, which is that labour is considered valuable based upon the monetary reward for it. So certain forms of labour that do not get given monetary reward are considered less valuable. Say, for example, child rearing, which means that women, by virtue of doing those kinds of activities, are less valuable based on the structures of their life. But the second thing is that the way that it actually operates when it interacts with women is to see women as a higher risk than men, which is why things like the relative pay gap between men and women exist. And that higher risk gives capitalist corporations and institutions an incentive to exploit women and an incentive also to continue to view them as riskier, because that is the way that they can retain, like lower cost labour, in a way that means that they systematically undervalue and entrench the norms that say women are less valuable than men. But secondly, we tell you that it entrenches male privilege in a particularly pernicious way. Capitalist movement reinforces purchasing power is the metric by which we ought to assess value within society, and it is obviously, at the outset true that men are wealthier, as in they have greater purchasing power, and it's just an additional metric which reinforces the power that is attached to masculine identities when you say that that metric is the most important within society, by virtue of the fact that they are capable of attaining more wealth and their wealth is self-generating, they are therefore more valuable in that way as well. That encourages male privilege. But secondly, it also gives a forum by which male institutions can perpetuate those systems of masculine power or those centres of masculine privilege. And that can be formally through institutions like boys-only clubs or boys' private schools, or the ways in which capitalism stratifies certain environments so that CEOs are always masculine. But it's also informal in the way that positions of power are able to shape the market force and the ways in which the market attributes value, even implicitly, in the kinds of products or the kinds of norms that are attached to those products, which is why masculinized imagery within the marketplace attaches to greater value. And in that way, male norms and the attachment of sexism is able to perpetuate within the market indirectly in that way. So the existence of capitalism concretizes and is an additional reinforcing metric to sexism within society by making male privilege more entrenched. Finally, on white nudism, the feminist movement. The important thing here is that capitalism, as I mentioned, views all things in the marketplace as part of a market rather than part of society. So ideas become a commodity within the capitalist movement, and obviously like feminist ideology is an idea to that extent, which means that the capitalist movement is capable of co-opting or taking or paying or valuing movements in a way that is monetary, and also means that capitalism can shape society by taking ideas from those things and then entrenching and neutering those movements in a way that exerts power over them. And that can also look like controlling spaces intellectually through things like money, like creating intellectual echo chambers which capitalism can dictate control over, given that it has a marketplace which it can exert influence over, and therefore in that way neuter the voices of feminist discourse. And all this really means is that feminists have an additional barrier in the ways that they are capable of expressing themselves, because it means that the things that they are expressing are commodified and are neutered by the existence of these structures. At the end of this speech, capitalism places values on things which are directly in conflict with the goals of the feminist movement. It makes it harder for feminists to organize, it makes it harder for feminist movement to be within public spaces, and it entrenches male privilege.
I'll do four things in this speech. I'll first talk about the effectiveness of the feminist movement under capitalism. Secondly, on why the selling of products from capitalist systems has been good for women, why the selling of labour has been good for women, and finally, fourthly, on kind of broader social changes that come about as a result of capitalism. On effectiveness of the movement, the affirmative here has three claims. The first of which is that you cannot collectivise because capitalism kind of atomizes people to be more individual. We all know what it means. The first is that the construction of a zero-sum game under capitalism is also wrong in many instances. That you can recognise that your purchasing power as a collective is more strong, in much the same way that you can recognise that you can still collectivise despite those capitalist systems that encourages people to have money in the first place. Because secondly, capitalism also gives women the capacity to collectivise in the future. That if you have less money because you are in a less productive society, that if you are not able to work because you are not given a reason to, you are less able to care about collectives if your focus is always on the bottom dollar as you otherwise would have to care about. And thirdly, that individualism is actually likely very good for women, that it gives women decision making in all kinds of feminism, all kinds of choices they would like to make, if you are able to be more individual, which empowers individual women. The second claim is that kind of creates hierarchies in the feminist structures that make it more difficult for people. But the kind of structures of privilege exist, separately to capitalism, like structures of racism that encourage, the voices of certain women to rise to the top, and hierarchies within that actually enhance the effectiveness of that movement. Then rather than having to hear the voices of everyone outside of that, it is useful to impose a structure on a feminist movement to do things to help people and be more effective. And feminism is not just about the ideological construct, it's about real tangible change for women, which comes about as the most effective form of what that action looks like. The final one is that there is a kind of competition of ideas within feminism that's bad for it, and it would be better to have a singular kind of that everyone agrees to, which is wrong. That it is good to have multiple competing multiple ideas that have value for them. That is how you get a structure of intersectional feminism against other forms of feminism, which is a result of being able to value different ideas differently. That's why the movement is more effective under capitalism, because people are more able to care about feminist changes. First argument here is on the selling of products, because capitalism creates incentive for the production of goods that otherwise would not exist. That companies are constantly looking to find new markets or new shares, and that women, are able to make products for themselves as well, and that the incentive of, your dollar is a far greater incentive than that of your vote, because it is directed to everyone. That if you're able to sell a product to women, it is going to be better for them. What are those products being? Because they have changed the lives of women in incredibly meaningful ways that would not have existed otherwise. That is, sexually, in the terms of the creation of the pill as a desire to sell things to women that have helped them have control over reproduction and change the lives of numbers of women. Or domestically, that the creation of household items like washing machines freed women from hours of labour that they otherwise would not have, which is incredibly important for them. That has liberated women from what they would otherwise be forced to do in a way that is meaningful and important. Or medically, like life-saving technologies for women in childbirth come about as a result of wanting to sell those to women and hospitals who can then profit off them. Because, importantly, women have control over things like household budgets or money in those forms, which are able to direct funds toward products that are good for them. That's why the creation of products that would not exist otherwise outside of a system of capitalism has been incredibly good for women. The second argument here is that the selling of labour has been really good for women, because women are more likely in the first place to get hired through a capitalist drive for efficiency. Because unlike what the affirmative team tells you, systems of sexism exist otherwise. And the argument that women are just as good workers, that women are, more able to do certain jobs than others, that is actually beneficial for your company to hire women if they are the better worker, where otherwise cultures or systems of sexism would encourage you to also continue hiring a man and continue the perpetuation of boys' clubs, which is why the recognition that women are often better workers or smarter or better in certain jobs is the way that you've gotten women into workforces that otherwise wouldn't exist for them. And it's only by a capitalist drive to have the best worker to be the most efficient that is able to combat those structures, those cultures of sexism that exist in the workplace otherwise, which is why, perhaps it remains that the labour of women is still valued less, but it would be far worse outside of a system of capitalism in which the work doesn't actually have equal value, and you are more likely to over time ascribe equal value to it when companies have to recognise that. And that means that you have more women going into workforces, you have more women doing jobs. That is going to be much better for them on an individual level, right? You're more able to get high in your way, more able to do things that are useful for you. But secondly, it gives you more options for identity. That you're able to define yourself through your work, which is empowering for many people. That being able to have give women choice in the way they construct their identities is far better under that, particularly in households when you're able to say that you are also a worker, and you're also, in addition to being a mother or in addition to being a wife, is important and useful for women. And that capitalism encouraging individual identity is particularly useful for that because it gives you options through which you identify yourself. And importantly, thirdly here, capitalism also changes the kinds of labour that people have done, or at least accelerated the movement away from kinds of work that benefited men, which is like hard labour, agricultural stuff, to which women had an incredible comparative disadvantage by physically being less strong, which means that the acceleration towards, late-stage capitalism has existed. It creates women a better advantage in being able to work in a way that is more useful or in a way that they can compete more, which is why the selling of labour under capitalism creates a more equal playing platform for women and empowers women to getting into work. The final argument here is that there are broader changes that come about as a result of capitalism that are incredibly important for women. The first thing to note here is that capitalism has decreased poverty in an enormously important way. That companies who have incentives to expand and reinvest in countries that otherwise do not have lots of money or do not have capital in them is the only way in which poverty has been battled in African states or across Southeast Asia, is by companies investing in those where otherwise underdeveloped states don't have the ability to put money through those, which is why how capitalism has managed to pull people out of poverty, which is particularly important for women because firstly, it increases the tolerance that people feel, and it means you're more likely to be amenable to feminism or to fight against sexism. Through structures like education that you have when you fight against poverty, and you're more able to invest in that people are able to recognize ideas and recognize their victory, which is why countries that are more educated are also less sexist, which comes about as a result of capitalist investment in them. But also, to note that the worst elements of poverty are normally felt by women. That means like gendered infanticide that you need in order to get ahead because you cannot have that many kids, or legal systems that are not able to be funded well enough that permit the constant abuse of women, or that aren't able to fight for women being killed, are systems that come about as a result of states being underdeveloped or countries being underdeveloped, which is fought by capitalism and that then brings about enormous effectiveness for women. And you have to then compare those things to the kinds of changes that the affirmative team is talking about, because even if you believe that the ability of feminist groups to form and lobby is slightly less effective, you have to think about the framework in which they are doing that lobbying, in which systems and states that are more developed, that are more educated, that are more able to implement changes that women are fighting for is better. So even if you believe their arguments in their very best case, the ways in which those changes can be implemented is more likely and more able to happen via capitalism, because as well, women are also individually given money as a result of that. Like the previous argument I give you about jobs is really important, because women having individual ways in which they are able to earn, or individual jobs or safety nets that they get as a result of capitalism gives them power in ways they otherwise would not have, and gives women independence, particularly in countries where it is desperately needed. So the biggest impact of capitalism also help women in the largest and the best ways by finding systems of poverty that are terrible for women. What I've shown you in this speech is that all aspects of capitalism, the selling of products, the selling of labour and its development, are enormously beneficial for feminism. It is not merely compatible, it is actively good, and that's why we're ahead.
I'm going to start the speech by examining 3 mistakes which characterize the downfall of the negative team. The first mistake is assuming that just because lots of ideas exist, those ideas are necessarily good. The problem with that is that it ignores the analysis at the end of Maddie's speech, which demonstrates the way in which capitalism, as a superstructure which exists over all of the ideologies that exist in society, shape those ideas in a way that make them only beneficial insofar as they help people enter the coercive system of capitalism in a way that's self-reinforcing. So they say it's good for there to be lots of ideas about feminism which you can subscribe to based on your own choice. The problem we identify is that the existence of capitalism encourages the construction of all of those ideas in a way that is only good enough insofar as it allows women to buy a certain product or a certain form of makeup, but it's not good enough to demonstrate that feminism can achieve equality for women in society, which is what it ought to be about. The second mistake that they make is to make just a bunch of arguments that are totally not mutually exclusive. Firstly, on capitalist investment, it is not true that capitalism is the only system by which other governments invest in other countries. For instance, the Soviet Union also put loads and loads of foreign direct investment into African countries during the Cold War, because there are also other incentives to do so, like political investment, or the fact that the Soviet Union, even though it's not capitalist, can still derive economic benefits from that investment. But secondly, it is just not true that capitalism has been good for these countries. The existence of large corporations in Africa has destabilized those societies in a way that, for instance, encourages like bribery of governments in a way that makes them less stable, and that encourages the types of sexist practices they suggest are bad. The other not mutually exclusive arguments they make are also things like people work under a capitalist system and therefore they can feel proud of the fact that they work. But people work under any economic system, and a system of collectivism like socialism also encourages people to value women for their labour insofar as it contributes to the benefit of the collective as opposed to the benefit to the individual. So it's not clear as to why that is a mutually exclusive benefit. The thing about the washing machine, like technological advances would still happen but for capitalism. People want to make their lives less inconvenient, and it's not sufficient to rely upon non-mutually exclusive examples on that side, because but for the existence of capitalism, it is our contention that feminism would have been way, way better. The third mistake that they make is to assume that the existence of the development of something that has helped women escape a coercive thing that they had to endure under capitalism capitalism is a good thing for women, but we've demonstrated that the existence of those coercive forces in the first place were the fault of capitalism. So capitalism is, in essence, only providing solutions to the problem that it itself created in the first place. The washing machine example is, again, a great example of this. The liberation of women from the kitchen and the laundry is a result of capitalism, not the demand for that was created by capitalism, yeah? Created by a system which values people for their labor, and that for a long time saw women as less worth it because of the inherent risk involved in hiring someone that might become pregnant. So it's not sufficient to rely upon those examples. I guess the fourth thing to suggest that it's not sufficient for the negative team to prove that in some instances there has been progression for women, yeah? That does not meet the burden that Maddie sets up at the start of the debate, which they do not challenge. The metric of the debate is whether or not capitalism is compatible with the fundamental goal of feminism, which is to achieve equality for women. It's not to say it's just enough to say that there have been some improvements. Our claim is that those improvements are in name only and they are not sufficient. I'm going to address two questions more broadly in this speech. First is on the nature of feminism. Note that they do not rebut the example, the argument about the way in which feminism encourages people to be less selfish, except for a number of reasons that do not make sense. Firstly, they say it's not always a zero-sum game. It is not clear as to why this is the case. Shorty's argument is like, well, people are encouraged to value their collective purchasing power, but that does not meet even the basic test of plausibility. No one in the workplace says, well, if I just sacrifice my salary a little bit, at least everyone in the office will be better off and we can collectively bargain in that way. No, often those offices actively discourage you from engaging in collective bargaining or even thinking about it because it's antithetical to the corporate control those people exercise over their workers. Capitalism encourages you to view yourself as an individual and therefore prioritize the individual benefits to yourself, which must necessarily come at the cost of other people. There are other responses to say, well, it honestly doesn't, the bottom dollar thing honestly doesn't make sense. We have proven to you that capitalism creates the set of circumstances in which you need money to buy into the forms of feminism that are popular in the first place currently, like things like corporate feminism or things like buying products to demonstrate that you're a feminist, which requires people to be rich in the first place and discourages solidarity for the individuals that need it most. Secondly, we tell you that this encourages the replication of capitalist structures within the feminist movement because the pervasiveness of capitalism, which is instilled in people from birth when they're taught in schools, for instance, you get taught to how to manage a shop in preschool or whatever, instills in people the idea that they should replicate the structures of capitalism in their day-to-day lives, particularly given that they have to go to work every day and it's dominated by the structures in every aspect of their life. And the only response to this argument is to say, well, the hierarchies are good, but that demonstrates a problem of understanding because it's not sufficient to say that some hierarchy in some theoretical sense is good. You have to examine the ways in which those hierarchies are actually constructed by capitalism. And it's certainly not the case that the people who are best representatives of the feminist movement are the people who get to the top. They're just the people who are best at accruing capital in that movement. By, for instance, putting other women down and saying that they're not feminist enough, or by achieving clout by making arbitrary rules in the feminist movement as to how you ought to behave, that people in a way that locks out other people from the feminist movement because they are people that could potentially challenge your foothold in that movement. So that is the way in which it damages the capacity of feminism to engage in the most important form of activity, which is collectivization to challenge the broad political and economic structures that oppress women, like the laws that say women can't get abortions, or the economic structures that prevent women from getting jobs. Thirdly, we say that this neuters feminism for three important reasons that they never respond to. Firstly, it encourages corporations to dominate the intellectual spaces which generate the capacity to make arguments against the existing political structures that oppress women. It dominates universities and encourages universities to be treated as corporate spaces to help people get jobs, instead of intellectual spaces which can make feminist arguments for why things ought not be the way they are. Secondly, it attaches value to masculine behaviours. Think about Sheryl Sandberg. All of the things that she encourages women to do are just things that men do, like talking in a deeper voice, like being more assertive in the workplace. It prioritises the masculine above the feminine in a way that makes it functionally impossible for women and the behavioural traits that women more commonly exhibit to gain equality in society. Thirdly, encourages the treatment of ideas as commodities, which neuters them when they enter the marketplace. So the negative team acts as if it's a good thing that people have feminist products nowadays. That is not a good thing. It encourages people to believe that feminism is just about showing that you believe in girl power by buying a t-shirt or by buying Sephora makeup. That is not the case. That is not sufficient to allow women to gain an equal foothold in society in a coercive system that would otherwise oppress them. Secondly, What does this do with respect to the nature, with the effectiveness of the feminist movement? I've already proven to you why it's unlikely that women will be able to collectivise. The second thing to note is that this entrenches male privilege. Their only response to this is to say, well, you hire women because of capitalism. I've already explained why it's not the case that this is a mutually exclusive argument. Like collective, economic systems also have heaps of reasons to try and maximise participation in their systems. We don't need to prove that those are necessarily better, but it's sufficient to just prove that capitalism is not the reason for which women are being hired here. But secondly, it is not the case that women will ever be treated equally, because there are biological factors with respect to cis women, like the fact that they have to bear children, that make them inherently riskier and therefore ascribe a lesser value to hiring them in the workplace. But thirdly, the problem is they never disprove our arguments presented at Maddie as to why the broader levers of power, like the control at the top, will always be dominated by men, because they were the ones that were rich in the past. Their wealth has accumulated exponentially, and they still control the systems of capitalism. So even if there are more women in the lesser down systems, the higher ups, the people who determine what gets to be made, who determine marketing decisions, never changes, and that is the white reason we live in the
It is unfortunately true that human societies at day zero are presumably sexist due to the differences between cis men and cis women biologically, then reshaping society, which is of course a pickup from Pacino that I guess you can be happy about if you want. The question of this debate is capitalism subsequently additive or detractive in its capacity to deal with that problem? And our belief is that ultimately, if you were to consider a society through a different framework that emphasized collectives more, instead of a society that encouraged people from day zero to atomize one another, you would be more likely to recover from that. And the simple reason is to think about interests. The people that hold strength, power, and capital are advantaged by patriarchy, and capitalism allows them to continue to perpetuate that. Whereas, when decision-making is merely made in the interests of the community, given, of course, sexism still exists and that decision-making will not be made perfectly, that is still a superstructure that is far less likely to do that. That is the problem with capitalism. It means that the people that benefit from patriarchy are the ones who continue to hold every single decision-making lever with regards to the structure of that society. There are two important questions of this debate. Firstly, how effective is the feminist movement in this society, in the community? And secondly, what does this do to the marketplace and how are various goods consumed? But I want to begin by rebutting the first 2 minutes of Pacino's speech. Because it was a bit of a jarring shift, because Shorty was actually willing to have the debate, and then Pacino just went crying to the ref, where he was like, incompatible is a very high burden. Well, I mean, for example, the most common use of the word incompatible is just when you're talking about technology, where it's just like two things that don't work together, right? So it's not like it's some artificially high burden. Like, we need to defend it not just being a bit bad for it, but it being bad to a factor of 10. We just need to demonstrate that the two things do not effectively work well together. That is what the word means. It is not some artificially high bar for us. The other thing that he obviously said is that we live in human societies, and so the vast majority of the problems of this debate are just symptoms of those societies. Insofar as that is true, and to a degree, of course, both teams in this debate have made and will make every time we make this debate questions as to the attributive factor of these things. But it is pretty critical to understand that when you live inside of a capitalist society, that means that from day zero, every single person that you are exposed to and every single decision that you are presented with is presented through a lens of either the cost to you of consumption or the potential benefit to you of earning. That is the superstructure that exists on literally every decision that you make. Everything in this room was made by capitalism. All of us are here at the expense of performing some other labour or some other way that we could spend our money. And that, of course, is not some marginal shift in the way people think. The superstructure of capitalism is massively influential in the way in which it changes people's minds, in which it atomizes them from one another. It is not a marginal shift, it is a large shift. So given that understanding of the correct burden of this debate, let us discuss the effects on the feminist movement. Maddie gives you an enormous amount of analysis here that receives very little response, because the first thing that she claims is that this is extremely effective at discouraging collectivization. So Tom in response was like, you can collectivize, and Kevin in response was then just like, what do you mean? And Pacino in response was like, oh, you legally can collectivize, which of course is true, but the question is about the proclivity to collectivize, not about the legal capacity to do so. And as I've already articulated, you're far less likely to attempt to collectivize in a world in which, you know, like capitalism strongly discourages collectivization because it means that you need to give up certain assets and things like that to yourself. The next thing, and we obviously also explain why collectivization is extremely critical. Pacino's response to that is the idea that some people lack the time and capacity to access the collective. Of course, that argument, if you apply any kind of comparative lens to it, immediately becomes an argument for our side. If you are unable to get with some sort of collective, of course it is going to be worse for you in terms of your ability to access sort of like the single plan activism that you're talking about. Like the kind of comparative you were pointing to there, the idea of individual people in a market society participating in a boycott. But the thing about a boycott is that you're not making a consumer purchase that you would have made but for the purchase, which means you're in a position worse off to where you would have been but for the boycott, which means if you're in a position in which you are unable to participate in collective organising, that assumedly means that resources are stretched to the limit, and you similarly can't incur the cost of the boycott. So it's unclear why he even thought that was an argument for his side. Obviously, if you do it comparatively, it's worse. The other thing to say, though, is obviously that if people are unable to participate in a collective from time to time, as people were able to do, in a community in which people do not necessarily believe that the most important determinant of your value is the input of your labour, your temporary inability to access the collective is not a reason that you would not be included from the fruits of that collective. That is in the same way that a lot of labour unions are willing to extend the contracts that they negotiate, which are better, with workers who were not members of the labour union, because collective identities, obviously labour unions are kind of like funny in this debate because they're people that attempt to collectivise that exist under capitalism, but the fact that they are comparatively more willing to do that than other negotiating frameworks indicates that collectivization leads people to believe that other people have worth in and of themselves, which is then important in terms of the way that the movement would bear fruits. The other thing that we hear is the idea that hierarchies would still exist, and I think kind of like the sneak push that they kind of get to is the idea that they would exist down other vectors like things like racism. Obviously, all of our analysis about the ways in which hierarchies are established around the perception of value applies equally to racism as it does to sexism, so presumably a reduction in that also leads to a reduction in the way that that would sort of operate inside of the movement. So while there would still, of course, be some hierarchy, in the first instance, it would still be like lesser in its effect. It would be a more horizontal organising structure. And in the second case, and probably the bigger benefit, it would be more determined democratically. And that's the other thing. This is, I think, the weirdest one for the opposition. They're like, oh, well, competition of ideas is an extremely good thing. As if like the process of literally discussing the benefits and downsides of some concept with another person is inherently capitalist. Like as if the idea of speech is capitalist, as if the idea of debate is capitalist. It is not. It is not a participant in some sort of economic superstructure. It is literally just the process of thought. And if the opposition wants to be like, oh, it's in a human society, then of course, having concepts that are discussed between one another are still likely to operate effectively there. This argument has demonstrated that the movement is far stronger, far more influential, and the norms that people participate in the community with as a result of that are also more aligned with the interests of feminism. And there are two implications as we enter the final issue on the market. Firstly, there is a dead weight loss for the opposition in this circumstance. But secondly, insofar as you believe any of their benefits are not entirely mutually exclusive, when the community is better oriented to serving the needs of women through these mechanisms, those factors of non-mutual exclusivity then become benefits for our side. So let's look to their three. Firstly, people are more likely to hire women. We had 5 responses, none of which got responded to. Firstly, people have sexist expectations about the value of women that mean that they are comparatively less likely to do so. Secondly, corporate structures mean you are often unwilling to risk hiring women because you know that they might fall pregnant. Thirdly, we exceptionalize the women who do get hired, which means, for example, Sheryl Sandberg is not seen as an avatar for feminism and what women can do. She is seen as an exceptional person that is somewhat outside of the class. Fourthly, the way that people are perceived is perceived exclusively on the basis of their value, which means even when they are hired, they are paid far less. And fifthly, they would still, to an important degree, receive some form of labour in an alternative economy. So the mere fact that they have some sort of autonomy is just a factor of the idea there would be any labour participated in under some sort of comparative. So that is not mutually exclusive. Secondly, the production of goods. Firstly, that is formulated by men. The washing machine was made by a man who tried to guess what a woman would want. And so comparatively, it is not clear that labour would be better spent elsewhere. Secondly, technological development is not necessarily done well under capitalism. Patent laws and duplications mean that the process of development, although eventually effective, requires an enormous amount of waste, and it is not sure that counterfactually that is actually a good process. And thirdly, women are poor, which means they are weak players in the marketplace. And that analysis applies far more strictly to their material about development. Of course, there would be some development, but capitalism has also led to massive environmental degradation, massive duplication, massive waste. 2/3 of the world's food is thrown out because it is not worth it to ship it over there. The idea that capitalism has been good for the alleviation of poverty is deeply contested in academic circles. Feminism is a good superstructure to organise the world under. Capitalism is a bad one. That is why they are incompatible.
They've tried to sneak you by not having a clear alternative in this debate, by not standing by anything, so that means they are able to somehow rubbish the system, which is one of the biggest changes in history, and mount one of the most ahistorical cases ever. To the extent that they're like, no, it was capitalism that had the incentive to keep women in the domestic sphere. No. Women have been in the domestic sphere, they've been dying in childbirth, and they've been unable to regulate their fertility for most of human history. But it is in the capitalist age where innovations and the encouragement for women to work take them out of there. What this team is coming up against is something that is like one of the biggest changes in the history of people, when otherwise they would resort to any other system like feudalism, which is much worse. Obviously, they seem to be supporting some vague socialism, also bad for women, also less likely to have those innovations. Four things in this speech. Firstly, on the strength of the movement. So they've relied on the strength of the movement within capitalism, which is not the most important argument in this debate, but I'll deal with it first anyway. So they suggest that collective bargaining is the only way for women to achieve salvation, but it is not. We have given you a number of alternative avenues. So the fact that this one becomes weaker is not necessarily debate winning if all of the others become stronger. But also, collective bargaining is bad for women, the same way that we said collective bargaining encourages you to coalesce around identities that are just about your social value with each other. That's why unions often collectivize around men, excluding women from the workforce in order to keep male wages high, because if women were to enter, there would be more competition in that market. So what you have to ask yourself is there any true benefit of collective action for women, given that we've given you a number of reasons to suggest it is not as viable as our capitalist alternatives? Because it is something that requires a lot of time and energy to opt in. It requires you to be a feminist to opt in, and it also requires people to kind of listen to you as a collective for that to work. They're like, well, maybe unions would altruistically extend their benefits to women, which is a tenuous argument at best, especially against the weight of human history. And also they never actually did the debating of leading this argumentation to benefits. They were like, collective bargaining could potentially lead to benefits, presumably to lobby a sexist government, the government which they would strengthen under their side of the house as opposed to market forces, because there's no idea given by them about what it was that collective bargaining would do. Right, whereas we think that you would have far more lobbying power, as Thomas tells you, when you're able to pool money and lobby using your power of your dollar. And for that reason, we have stronger bargaining on our side of the house, and they did not lead it to benefits, whereas we led you to benefits on our side of the house. The next thing they say is the problem with capitalism is that it supersedes everything and it infects everything it touches, which of course is a problem of every system in the sense that every system is a superseding system. But luckily, capitalism's superstructure is the structure of being unstructured. It's the one of trying new things. And that's going to be a theme in the rest of this argumentation, and that is why that argument falls down. Second issue, on poverty and development. Ben says that the idea that capitalism has been good for poverty alleviation is deeply contested in academic circles as his main argumentation against it, but is in fact one of the least contested ideas. All of the data is on our side. So if you're looking to academic circles, feminism and capitalism are aligned. We gave you two mechanisms which have not been responded to. The first was about the correlation of education with tolerance, no response from Shorty. Secondly, it's about how women lose out in a system of poverty. And given that the alternative to capitalism is languishing in poverty more, and that is incredibly harmful for women, because as feminism would have you know, women are people too, we think that Poverty alleviation under our side of the house is a huge benefit that they have not contended with and is a bigger benefit than anything else they've approved in this debate. Next, a third issue on the selling of goods. There's a few, firstly, on the more innovation for women. We tell you that there's not only more innovation targeted at women, but there's also more innovation generally, which is helpful for women. And we gave you structural reasons why capitalism leads to innovation. They asserted that innovation can happen under their side. We're the only one that has led you through argumentation to those benefits. And those benefits are huge. Their best response is like, well, maybe patents mean that innovation something. There's no reason to expect then that patents are capitalist or anti-capitalist as forces. What matters is that we showed you that innovation was huge. So even if they're like, we could hypothetically invent the pill under our side of the house, our side was the one that put it in every chemist and gave you the ability to buy it and the freedom to buy it. Those technologies are the biggest changes in women's lives over the course of history. Not collective bargaining, not anything else, except for having the pill everywhere, except for having a washing machine in every home. And that stuff is going to continue, and that is why we're clearly ahead on that front, and capitalism does lead to innovation. Next, on purchasing power, they're like, well, boycotts cost you money, but it might not actually cost you money to buy a more feminist or feminine product over a more masculine one. So that's not a loss to you. A company might have a comparative advantage over another one by making its product better for women. And that was the purchasing power we talked about. It doesn't have to be the loss that occurs in a boycott when there's no more feminist alternative. And so women are able to exercise this purchasing power. And we gave you the mechanism from first, which is that even in most sexist societies, women are likely to control the household budget because they are working in the domestic sphere. What do they say? One thing that makes no sense that they say is like, men have entrenched their power over time, as if like they kind of try and use the same mechanism like how white people have entrenched their power over time. But that's not true, because a man could give birth, well, can't give birth, well, some men can, but to a woman. And so for that reason, they can't entrench their power over time like that. So, but also, so then they kind of scale back that harm, and they're like, those who benefit from patriarchy have a comparative advantage in most markets, and so they are likely to have the most money. But that's not true, because it is not inherent to capitalism. That's about sexism, right? But capitalism is the system that erodes against that, because it is untrue that men have literal any comparative advantage, like have any advantage over women in skills, and so for that reason it erodes away that norm. Whereas the structures of government are much worse. For example, you might actually have an advantage as a politician by seeming more reasonable, by seeming like you're just more trustworthy. And all of those things are things that you have to compare against each other. So women are far more likely to be hired in companies or to get money from companies than they ever were to be hired, like to be voted in governments. Lastly, in selling of labour. Firstly, we told you that capitalism, as in our poverty point, has moved us away from muscle labour to labour of the mind and machine labour, and that is the only way to get women into the workforce and to give them that equality, rather than making them worse than the men that they compete with. And we get very limited response for them on that front. And then what do they say instead? They kind of live in this kind of Sheryl Sandberg bubble, as if that is all labour is. They're like, oh, you might rise to the top by crushing others, which is like illiterate of capitalism, where the whole premise is that it doesn't have to be a zero-sum game, and that you can kind of profit while others also profit. Secondly, they were like, oh, all of their reasons, they're like, we have 5 reasons, most of which just scale back to like pregnancy is a disadvantage that you have, but makes you inherently riskier. But importantly, it wasn't capitalism that like puts you in that situation. That is a biological factor, but capitalism has the technological innovations that make pregnancies easier to manage, i.e. the breast pump at work is a capitalist innovation. Lastly, it gives you a different way to define yourself outside of your gender role. They never said another definition of yourself other than your gender role. So all I've got is gender role and your labour at the end of this debate. We'd rather you have 2 rather than 1. Thank you.
first on the output of the feminist movement, and then secondly on the structure of the movement. On the output of the movement, we show you that a series of enormously large benefits for women have resulted directly out from capitalism. Those were products that changed the lives of women, those were investments that reduced the gendered harms of poverty, or those were incentives for companies to hire more women. And all of those, as we tell you, are the most impactful things on women and the feminist movement, of giving women choice and freedom they otherwise did not have. And the main strategy of the affirmative team to deal with this argument is to claim that that is not an exclusive benefit, and socialist countries also invest in places and also hire people, which firstly, we tell you that investment is slower, lesser, and worse in Pacino's speech, that the incentives of capitalism are far stronger in those instances in encouraging things, but secondly, and honestly, crucially, that is not a reason that capitalism is incompatible with feminism. That proving that other countries that other systems might also employ women or invest in places is perhaps a reason that other things are more compatible with feminism or also compatible with feminism, but they are not reasons that capitalism as a system is incompatible with feminism. Because we've given you direct reasons why capitalism is actively good for feminism, and even if those are mirrored in other systems as well, which is essentially the sole strategy to deal with that, that is not a reason it's incompatible, and that is why the clearest and largest benefits are ways in which capitalism is not incompatible. And so the burden on them is then to prove that investment or technology was actively harmful for women. And to be fair, they give a stab at it. The first is, well, capitalism also hurt those nations, like the environmental harms, but all of the things we tell you were on the specifically gendered elements of it. So even if it was on net worth and you believe the best version of that argument, which they never actually prove, is that the gendered elements of this investment or these technologies are better under our side, which is why it is better for the feminist movement. Or secondly, they're like, maybe you hire less women because of pregnancy fears, but we tell you much more convincingly that this harm, that the incentives of success or the incentives of profit are the best ways to overcome otherwise irrational sexist ideologies that only result from that. So all of the best things that have happened for the feminist movement in many instances have come about as a result of this, and that is why it is not incompatible. And note here, this is a really clear and grounded and empirical fact about how the feminist movement and capitalism has interacted. And the second issue, if you think about it, the end goal of saying that the feminist movement is poorly structured is that it might have bad outcomes. But if we show you now that the feminist movement as a result of capitalism has actively and empirically had good outcomes, it does not matter if the structure of the movement may suggest it would be bad, we have proven that it has not been bad. But that is why we have won the debate at that moment. But I'll next deal with the structure of the movement in general. The affirmative team has two stats here. The first is that capitalism discourages collectivization as a result of atomization of people. Firstly, we tell you that collectivization is not the be-all and end-all and is not that important, and often is actively detrimental for excluding women in those instances. And the individual benefits that accrue to women and accrue to feminists are more important. But secondly, we tell you even that you are also likely to be excluded or have hierarchies based on your social identities as well as just as money, so that is not a harm that they eliminate. And thirdly, you are more able to collectivize, in fact, when you have more money and are more enfranchised, which happens under capitalism, that you are then able to care and join collectives when you are not so afraid of your money, as I tell you in my speech. That's why collectivism is not that important, and if it was, likely better under capitalism. The second attempt is perhaps this damages the ideology of feminism. You're more likely to be kind of selfish. But as we tell you in Pacino's speech, those are harms of humans, not harms of capitalism, which is not an exclusive harm. And that individualism was actively good for many women, that affording people choices in the things they did or the identities they ascribed to was actively beneficial. And perhaps this, and as I told you, this could indicate that perhaps that capitalism has been bad for feminism. What I proved to you in my first issue is that it has not, and at the very least is not incompatible with it. That's why the negative one.
We have been extraordinarily generous in a way that the negative team has not, and that is why we have won this debate. Because if you look back in Maddie's speech, every single one of her arguments has an explanation for why the unique ideology of capitalism, which encourages individuals to value themselves as individuals and to value themselves according to their human capital, an ideology which is unique to capital and not a result of sexism or racism, are responsible for the fragmentation of the feminist movement and the neutering of its ideology in a way that makes it functionally useless. those are arguments that the negative team has fundamentally failed to contend with. And perhaps their best example of their truly baffling inability to understand this very simple argument is their argument about development, because actually we do provide two incredibly persuasive responses to it. Firstly, that capitalism, because it values profit over individuals, is responsible for the need of development of those developing countries in the first instance. And secondly, that when those investments happen, they happen in an incredibly exploitative way. See the reasons I provide in my speech as to why it's likely to, for instance, destabilize the governments that could offer their citizens protection. So that is the misunderstanding that is crucial to understanding the failure of the negative team. Because they say, oh, well, you know, sexism exists, lots of these things are to do with sexism, but we have provided reasons to believe that each of the problems that we identify with the compatibility of feminism with capitalism are due to the way in which capitalism fragmentizes individuals in a way that's unique to capitalism, that is not true of sexism. I'll ask two questions in this reply speech. The first will be on the effectiveness of the movement. The first harm that we provide you is that this discourages individuals from collectivizing for two reasons. The first is that the zero-sum game of capitalism, which requires you to succeed at the cost of other individuals by robbing them of capital and instead accruing it for yourself, makes you tread on other women and makes you believe that the only way that you can succeed is on your own instead as a part of a collective, which is why also the harms that we provide, such as prioritizing the masculine over the feminine at every given stage, are unique to capitalism because it's only the case when you have to succeed as an individual that you default to the norms that masculinity ascribes as being the way in which you succeed in the workplace. And their responses to this are only twofold, and they're both quite foolish. The first is to say that we never provide benefit. But we do, you know, like it's like you need to challenge the political structures that oppress you. The only way you can do that is on collective action, not the actions of individuals who individually kind of, you know, do their best but eventually fail. And the second response is to just say, but you do boycotts instead, which ignores the argument that Beach provides you, which is that if you're too poor to collectivize, you're probably also too poor to engage in meaningful forms of collective action, of individual action, like challenging your sexist employer. Secondly, we prove that the hierarchies that are generated under capitalism are uniquely bad for the reason that capitalism encourages individuals to value their individual capital, which means the people who rise to the top in trade unions, which are men under a capitalist system, happen to be the individuals who are best at locking out other individuals from those collectives, who are best at accruing the capital that exists under capitalism. An alternative hierarchy would exist under a collective system, but it would not be determined by the individual capital which those individuals possess. And thirdly, we tell you that women inherently, due to historical imbalances, have less purchasing power than men, which is not only a reason why the technological advancement that you get under capitalism is worse, as Ben provides you in his speech, but it also means that the most crucial argument that we provide you remains unchallenged by the negative team, which is that even if you get marginal advances in the position of women in society, the fact that men have accrued exponentially the wealth in society, and that capitalism makes that wealth the driver of who has power and who does not in society, means that women will always be oppressed by capitalism in a way that is not true in a collectivist system which values people according to their individual worth as opposed to their individual capital. But finally, they've never addressed the arguments about how corporatization of universities or the corporatization of ideas allows corporations to purchase those ideas and neuter them when they become threatening to them in a way that makes the core ideology of feminism functionally useless to challenge the system that oppresses women. On all those reasons, we have conclusively won this debate.